There's a room inside a small-town hospital that nobody ever talks about in the open, but everyone knows its reputation. It's officially called ICU Room 6, just one of the intensive care units tucked away at the far end of the corridor on the third floor. If you walk down that hallway at night, you'll notice something strange. All the other rooms will have nurses going in and out, doctors checking charts, family members whispering prayers. But when you pass by ICU Room 6, it feels like the entire building holds its breath. Nobody wants to linger near its door, and no nurse volunteers to do the night shift inside. The reason is simple and terrifying. Every patient who has ever been moved into ICU Room 6 dies before morning. Not a few, not most, but every single one. The staff don't write it in reports, and you'll never find it in official records. But ask any nurse who has worked the night shift long enough, and they'll tell you. The patients never make it past midnight. Of course, if you're new to the hospital, you laugh it off. A haunted room? In a place full of science, medicine, and life-saving machines? It sounds ridiculous, but then you work a few shifts, and you start noticing things yourself. Strange, small things that no one can really explain. For example, the machines inside Room 6 almost never behave normally. The monitors beep randomly, even when nothing is wrong with the patient. The heart rate monitor will spike suddenly in the middle of the night, showing panic or pain, but the patient is asleep, perfectly still. Then just as suddenly it goes back to normal, like nothing ever happened. Sometimes the room temperature changes in an instant. One nurse said she walked in, and it felt like she'd stepped inside a freezer. Her breath fogged up in the air. She checked the thermostat. Nothing was wrong. It was set exactly like all the other rooms. Yet the cold wrapped around her, sinking deep into her bones, and she swore she heard someone breathing right behind her ear. She spun around. Nobody was there. There are also the sounds. The hospital at night is never truly quiet. You hear footsteps in the hall, the rolling of carts, the faint hum of machines. But when you stand outside Room 6, it feels different. Nurses have reported hearing heavy, labored breathing on the other side of the door, even when the patient inside was sedated and connected to a ventilator. Some say they heard whispering too, muffled and low, like two people having a conversation in the corner. But when they opened the door, the room was empty except for the patient, unconscious and still. The strangest reports, though, come from the security team. The hospital has cameras in every ICU room, and Room 6 is no exception. On multiple occasions, the night shift guards watching the monitors have called in nurses, panicked. They said there was someone else in the room. Not a nurse, not a doctor, just a figure, tall and thin, standing next to the patient's bed. The figure doesn't move much. Sometimes it leans forward, bending over the patient's face, almost as if listening to their final breaths. Other times it just stands in the corner, head tilted at an unnatural angle, staring. But the moment staff rush into the room, the bed is empty, the corner is empty, and the figure is gone. The cameras, of course, show nothing afterward, as if it never happened. At first, management tried to dismiss it. Technical glitch, they said. Old wiring in the machines. They even had engineers check the monitors, the thermostats, the cameras. Nothing was wrong. The machines worked fine during the day, but at night, especially close to midnight, the activity always returned. The story spread fast among the staff. Nurses refused to stay alone in that room. If a patient had to be moved there, 2 or 3 nurses would go together, never one. Family members visiting patients sometimes complained about the atmosphere too. One woman said she visited her father late one night and found him wide awake, trembling. He pointed to the corner and whispered, "He's been here the whole time, just watching me." But the woman saw nothing. Less than 2 hours later, her father died. That pattern repeats over and over. Stable patients, those who were expected to recover, would get assigned to Room 6 because no other space was available. At first, everything would be fine. But as the night wore on, they would become restless, frightened, sometimes begging to be moved. Then, just after midnight, the machines would scream, the heart would crash, and no amount of medical intervention could bring them back. It didn't matter if they were young or old, strong or fragile. Nobody survived the night in room 6. The staff began to notice something even more chilling. Every single patient died around the same time. Not in the afternoon, not during morning rounds. Always within minutes after midnight. As if someone or something was waiting for the clock to strike 12 before claiming them. You can imagine how the new hires react when they first hear about this. Some laugh nervously, some don't believe it at all. But eventually, almost every nurse who works at night experiences something inside that room they can't explain. One nurse reported she saw the reflection of a man in the glass window of the heart monitor. A man who wasn't in the room. She described him as tall, thin, wearing something that looked like an old doctor's coat. But his head was tilted to the side, as though his neck was broken. She screamed and ran out. By the time she returned with another nurse, the patient inside was dead. Even the cleaning staff hate that hallway. They say the lights flicker only outside room 6. The janitor once said he was pushing his cart past the door when he heard someone knock from the inside. 3 knocks, slow, heavy. He thought maybe the patient needed help, so he peeked in. The patient was unconscious, connected to a ventilator. Nobody else was there. He never walked that corridor again. Over time, the staff began to avoid putting patients in room 6 unless they absolutely had no other choice. But in emergencies, when the hospital is overcrowded, there is no way to avoid it. And so the cycle continues. Another patient moved in. Another patient lost by morning. People outside the hospital never hear these stories in full. Families are told that their loved ones simply had complications, that their condition worsened unexpectedly. On paper, that's all it is. But the staff know they've seen too many to believe it's just coincidence. That's why, late at night, if you ever find yourself in that hospital and you decide to walk down the ICU hallway, you'll notice something. The air will grow colder, the lights will feel dimmer, and when you reach the door marked room 6, you might feel the hairs on your arms stand up, your chest tighten, and the strange sense that someone is standing just behind you, watching, waiting. And if you're brave enough to listen carefully, you might just hear it too. A slow, heavy breath, right on the other side of the door. One evening, the cycle repeated itself, and it would be the night that almost everyone in the hospital remembered in whispers for years. A man named Thomas Gray was admitted after a violent car accident. He was 47 years old, still conscious when they brought him in, and though he was badly injured, the doctors were confident that he would recover. He wasn't considered critical. His vitals were stable, his injuries had been treated, and the prognosis looked good. But that night, the hospital was unusually crowded. The other ICU rooms were already occupied, and the only space left for Thomas was in the one room that everyone hoped they could keep empty. Room 6. The nurses exchanged glances when the order came through. Some looked away, pretending not to hear. Nobody wanted to be the one to tell Thomas's family. Eventually, one of the doctors simply wrote it down and had him transferred there. Officially, they couldn't refuse. A bed was a bed, and the patient needed a place to stay. At first, everything seemed normal. Thomas was moved in around 9 o'clock. His wife visited briefly, holding his hand and promising she would return in the morning. Thomas smiled at her, even joked lightly with the nurses, thanking them for their care. He didn't seem frightened, not like some patients who had heard the whispers about this room before. He was calm, tired, ready to sleep. The machines hummed steadily. His heart rate was smooth, his oxygen level perfect. For a while, the night felt ordinary. But then, close to midnight, things began to change. It started small. One of the nurses who was on shift swore that as she walked past the door, she heard someone speaking inside. She stopped, thinking maybe Thomas was on the phone with his family. But when she peeked in through the small window, he was alone, his phone nowhere near him. His eyes were closed. And yet she swore she heard a second voice, low, deep, almost like a murmur. She shook it off, telling herself it was just her imagination, just exhaustion from a long shift. Around 11:45, Thomas stirred awake. He called out for the nurse, his voice trembling. When she entered, He was staring at the far corner of the room, his eyes wide. "Why is there someone sitting in that chair?" he asked, his hand shaking as he pointed. The nurse followed his finger. The chair was empty. She told him gently that nobody was there, but Thomas insisted. He described a tall man, thin, sitting in the chair with his head bent to the side. He said he could hear him breathing. The nurse tried to reassure him, adjusting his blanket, checking his vitals, which remained normal. But when she looked into his face, she saw the kind of fear that wasn't easy to dismiss. Minutes later, he spoke again, this time more urgently. "He's not sitting anymore. He's standing at the door now. He's watching you." His voice cracked on the last word. The nurse turned sharply, her eyes scanning the doorway. Nothing, only the open space, the hallway light spilling in. But Thomas's gaze didn't waver. He stared as if the figure was standing right there, solid, undeniable. The nurse tried to calm him down, reminding him that sometimes medications could cause hallucinations. But deep down she felt a chill. Patients had said things like this before, always in this room, always right before the end. The minutes dragged toward midnight, the air inside the room growing heavier, colder. Another nurse joined to check on him. But Thomas refused to take his eyes off the door. His breathing grew shallow, his chest rising and falling in short bursts, as though he were preparing to run. He whispered, "He's closer now." The nurses exchanged looks, unease settling into their bones. One of them noticed that the temperature gauge on the wall had dipped 3 degrees in less than 10 minutes. The machines continued to hum, but the room felt unnatural, like the world had bent slightly out of shape. At exactly 12 o'clock, the heart monitor gave a sharp beep. Not a flat line, but a warning. Thomas clutched at his chest, gasping. His eyes locked on a space just above his bed. He whispered, "He's leaning over me." His words barely audible, more like a dying breath. The nurses saw nothing, only the pale light reflecting off the sterile walls. They rushed to adjust his oxygen mask, to check his pulse, but then, at 12:01, the monitor shrieked. His heartbeat plummeted, collapsing into chaos. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, flatline. The nurses shouted for help. Within seconds, doctors poured into the room, launching into emergency procedures, chest compressions, adrenaline injections, electric shocks to the heart. The room filled with urgency and noise, but it was useless. His body responded for a moment, then fell still again. He was gone. Thomas Gray, a man expected to survive, pronounced dead just after midnight in room 6. The medical team stood around, exhausted, confused, unable to explain what had happened. Officially, the records showed cardiac arrest. Another tragedy. Nothing unusual, but every person in that room felt it in their bones. It wasn't natural. It wasn't medicine that failed. It was something else. Something that had been waiting, patient, silent, until the clock struck 12. After the team left, one of the younger nurses lingered behind to clean up the equipment. She hated being alone in that room, especially after what had just happened. She moved quickly, gathering supplies, trying not to look at the empty chair in the corner. But then she noticed something strange. The heart monitor, which had been turned off, flickered once, just once, and displayed a single green line. Beep. She froze, her heart racing. The machine was unplugged. She dropped the supplies and ran out of the room, refusing to step back inside until morning. The next day, whispers spread across the hospital like wildfire. Another patient gone. Another death after midnight. Some staff rolled their eyes, blaming coincidence. But most didn't need convincing anymore. They knew room 6 had claimed another. It was that night with Thomas Gray that solidified the legend among the staff. Before they could try to brush off the stories, call them superstition. But Thomas wasn't supposed to die. His case was hopeful, his condition steady. And yet the room had taken him, just as it had taken every other patient before him. From then on, nurses began refusing outright. They begged supervisors not to put patients in there. Some even threatened to quit if they were forced to work the night shift near that door. The hospital management, of course, ignored the ghost stories, They cared about efficiency, about filling beds, about paperwork. But among the staff, it became an unspoken rule. If you walked down the ICU hallway after dark, you did not look at the window of room 6. You did not listen to carefully at its door, because if you did, you might see or hear something you weren't supposed to. And once you did, you'd never forget it. And what scared them most wasn't just what they had heard or seen, but the timing. Always the same, always after midnight, as though the room itself belonged to someone who only woke when the world outside had fallen asleep. The night after Thomas Gray died, the nurses who had been on duty swore they would never step inside room 6 again. Their voices shook when they recounted what he had said in his final moments, how he had described a tall man leaning over him, how he had begged to be moved. For them, there was no denying it anymore. The stories were real. The figure was real. But while most staff preferred to look away, to bury the truth under silence, a few of the older workers finally began to talk. They said it was time for the younger ones to know why room 6 had always been cursed, why no patient survived after midnight. Years ago, before the hospital had been renovated into what it is now, that part of the building was not an ICU at all. It was the morgue. Bodies were kept there temporarily before being transferred to the county facility. During that time, there was a doctor on staff, a man whose name has been carefully erased from official records, but whose shadow still lingers in whispers. He had an obsession with death. He didn't just treat patients, he experimented on them. People said he believed that if he could catch the moment right between life and death, if he could force the body back into function, he could cheat mortality itself. Some called him brilliant, others insane, but in the end, all that remained were corpses. Patients who should have lived died under his care. People who had already passed were mutilated under the excuse of research. According to one nurse who had worked there decades ago, the doctor would stay in the morgue at night, long after his shift ended. She claimed she heard the sound of saws, the clatter of instruments, muffled voices as if he was speaking to the dead. At first, nobody dared confront him. He had authority, prestige, but soon the number of unexplained deaths became impossible to ignore. Families started to ask questions, and staff began to grow suspicious. Eventually, the truth surfaced. The doctor was caught performing one of his so-called experiments in the morgue. Instead of treating the body with dignity, he was cutting it open, wiring machines into its chest, trying to make the heart beat again. The horror spread like wildfire, and he was immediately suspended, with a trial pending. But the trial never came. One night, before he could be taken away, he hanged himself inside the morgue using his own belt, his body swaying right above the table where so many of his victims had lain. When they found him, his head was tilted sharply to the side, his face pale, his eyes open wide as though still watching. The staff who discovered him never forgot that image. His body was removed, but his presence, it seemed, remained. And when the hospital was renovated, when the morgue was transformed into a bright new ICU, that room became room 6. From then on, death never left it. Nurses claimed that patients admitted they're often described seeing a man in a doctor's coat, tall and thin, head bent unnaturally, as if the neck was still broken from the hanging. He never spoke, they said, only stood close staring, waiting for the moment the clock ticked past midnight. And when it did, the patient's life ended, no matter what their condition had been hours before. The timing was too precise to dismiss. It wasn't coincidence. Say it was ritual. What disturbed the staff most was the way the patients always seemed to know. Hours before their final breath, they grew restless, frightened, begging to be moved, whispering about the figure. One nurse remembered a young woman, only 25, who had been recovering well after surgery. She begged them not to leave her alone. She screamed that the doctor was in the room, that he was standing beside her bed waiting. They stayed with her as long as they could, holding her hand, telling her she was safe. But at midnight, as if on cue, her heart monitor shrieked, and within minutes she was gone. The hospital administrators tried everything. They repainted the room. They brought in priests, pastors, even skeptics to bless the space, to to rid it of whatever was haunting it. For a few days it would feel normal again, calm, quiet. But as soon as another patient was placed inside, the cycle continued. The staff stopped believing it could be fixed. It wasn't the walls or the machines. It was him, the doctor who had refused to let death go. He was still there and he wasn't leaving. Rumors spread that if you stood outside the door of room 6 exactly at midnight, you could hear the sound of machines running, even when the room was empty. Some said you could hear footsteps pacing slowly, dragging back and forth across the floor. Others claimed to hear breathing, long and heavy, right against the door. A security guard once swore. He saw someone's shadow moving under the crack of the door when he walked past at 12:15. He opened it, bracing himself, but the room was empty, spotless, and cold as ice. The staff grew to fear it so much that eventually, whenever possible, room 6 was kept locked, an unspoken agreement that no one entered unless absolutely necessary. Families visiting the ICU sometimes asked why one room was always closed. The nurses only smiled, giving vague answers. They could never tell the truth. How could they explain that the room itself belonged to a man who was long dead? A man who had turned healing into torture. A man who refused to leave his post even in death. Yet every so often, when the hospital overflowed and all other rooms were full, a patient would be placed in room 6. And each time the story repeated. Fear in the patient's eyes, whispers of a figure standing over them, the inevitable death after midnight. Nobody survived. The staff kept their heads down, writing the official reports, pretending it was just another tragedy. But among themselves, they knew it wasn't a tragedy at all. It was a pattern, a curse, a promise that the doctor was still watching. And what made it worse was the silence of the higher-ups. They knew too, though they would never admit it. Some even encouraged staff not to spread rumors, threatening jobs if the stories continued. But no threats could erase what the nurses had seen with their own eyes. They knew what the cameras showed. They knew what their patients described in their final breaths. And when they walked that hallway at night, that they knew to avoid looking too closely at the door of room 6, because sometimes, in the reflection of its window, you could see him staring back. To this day, the room remains, locked more often than not, but still there. A place the hospital can't get rid of, can't erase. Some nights, staff swear they hear the heart monitor inside beeping faintly, though the machines are disconnected. Others hear the metallic clatter of instruments being picked up and set down, as if someone is preparing for surgery that should never happen. No one dares to stay too long near the door at midnight. But for those who have been unlucky enough to witness it, they all describe the same thing. A tall figure in an old coat, head bent at a strange angle, standing in the corner of the room, watching, waiting for the moment the clock ticks past 12. And once you've seen him, once you've heard his breath, you will never forget it. Because room 6 doesn't just take patients, it keeps them.